Some of the thinking we see from children is that around age 2 they start to have an internalized sense of their own gender. This is based largely on the feedback they receive from the world around them. Additionally, they don't have a concept of gender permanence. A boy will likely think wearing pink will turn him into a girl. This creates potentially very rigid definitions of what is male or female and what is masculine or feminine, especially given the influential role of environmental messages, the earliest of which are the feedback the child receives from the parents. Sons and daughters are treated very different, and you see this from birth. Even before birth, parents are deciding what clothing, what toys their son and daughter will play with or wear, depending upon their gender. Parental attitudes towards sons and daughters is very different, and these differences in parenting are going to be filtered through a child's gender schemas and influence their identification as male or female. In the ways that parents speak to their children, there are stark differences in gender. Boys are in general encouraged to be more active in sports and roll around in the mud, whereas little girls are encouraged to be the nurturer and play house, take care of their dolls. And while these parental attitudes are somewhat generalized, nonetheless, they hold some truth and are influential in the child's development. They become even more evident as the child progresses out of the parental environment and begins to interact with the larger aspects of the culture, such as school, the kids from the neighborhood, and the media. This is where social learning becomes very influential, and also when we see the influence of psychological factors such as schemas really begin to take a hold. With increased exposure to the media and peers, how a child identifies as male or female becomes even more internalized, and this definition will likely become much more rigid as a child ages. Recalling how a young child lacks knowledge of gender permanence and fears they may become the other gender if they deviate from the behaviors, attitudes, and emotional expressions typically associated with their gender, we begin to see that these lines and definitions become more pronounced as feedback from their peers at school and the neighborhood reinforce the distorted messages adopted from the media. One of the things that makes a child vulnerable to these messages is understanding that young children do not have the ability to filter out information that is unbeneficial or biased until early adolescence. All behavior they see from characters in the media that they can identify with is seen as a beneficial learning experience on what it means to be human and man or woman. This is the reason there's a lot of debate about advertising towards children. If a child can't tell they are trying to be sold a product, they also cannot tell that the behavior they see from the Goodfellas and Tony Montana is not beneficial behavior to mimic if they wish to be successful in interpersonal relationships and life in general. In terms of the media's portrayal of gender roles, we get the sense that boys and men are impenetrable juggernauts, incapable of emotional expression, and that if a man displays emotion publicly, he is weak and not really a man. Girls and women, on the other hand, are portrayed as sugar and spice and everything nice. That is, unless something is getting in the way of them getting attention from men. This highlights one of the most unhealthy aspects of American media. That is the prevalence of misogyny, the principle of mistreating women, and the corresponding gender roles of dominance and submission that lead to very distorted ideals of what it means to be man or woman, let alone human. These attitudes are so prevalent that they've also infiltrated the professional world, and actually most individuals are unaware that such biases exist in their subconscious. Additionally, as humans age, one of the largest misconceptions begins to develop and is reinforced by the cultural feedback such as masculine dominance that is pushed forth in Hollywood, TV, and the jokes in high school cafeterias. This misconception is that gender is equal to sexuality, and that one's sexuality defines one's gender. This means that for a man to be a man's man, as they call it, he must conquer the bedroom and lay spoils to the vast ocean of able-bodied women. Unfortunately, because the media is somewhat biased, an equal portrayal of women is absent. In fact, if a woman goes and does the same thing, trying to conquer all the men she can,
she is looked at as unladylike and actually serves to degrade women as a whole, which is very backwards. This is an obvious yet accepted double standard in our culture. Interestingly, sexual behavior really is not a marker of whether a person is a male or female, or even human for that matter, especially considering that viewing sexuality in these terms can lead a person to adopt attitudes toward their romantic interests that will rob them of a fruitful relationship. Nonetheless, as we follow these horrible stereotypes, attitudes, and gender roles that are presented in American culture, we begin to see that the spiderweb becomes even more complex as the standard for romantic interest becomes heterosexuality. Going back to the cognitive distortion that most humans have, viewing things in terms of black or white, this creates two opposite categories, heterosexual and homosexual, with no room in between. However, in the study of human sexuality, such rigidly defined categories is not useful and is considered inaccurate. Instead, human sexuality is conceptualized as being on a sliding scale, with heterosexual on one end of the spectrum and homosexual on the other end, with bisexual being in the middle. Sexuality is not permanent either, and many individuals move from place to place on this sliding scale throughout their life before reaching a comfortable sexual orientation for themselves as an individual. Returning to the idea that wearing pink will make a boy become a girl, it seems to be the same cognitive process underlying homophobia. The idea that hanging around homosexuals will change who you are attracted to is rather absurd, and could be related to the type of thinking seen in children that supposedly disappears as the child develops. Additionally, returning to how socialization is not the only thread in the spiderweb of who we are, there's some research that indicates biological factors may influence whether a person is homosexual or not. In a study of identical twins, researchers found that men who had an extra piece on the tip of their X chromosome were more likely to be homosexual, as were their identical twin. This suggests that there may be more to it than simple choice. So as we look at all these factors that influence how we are, who we are, we begin to see that it's very interwoven. It's intricate, the way that all these factors interrelate and influence one another, that there's not just one reason why we are the way we are, that it comes from a combination of factors that are all connected like a spider web that make up the sum of the whole. In all, this information challenges the common definitions of what it means to be man, woman, and human, while also encouraging us to break past the stereotypes and limitations we have placed upon ourselves, culture, and the way that we can connect with and help other human beings. You put it all into perspective that, yeah, these differences seem rather large, but really they're not. We all experience emotions, we experience the same emotions, we have behaviors that we do, it very much varies by individual. And when you zoom out a little bit, it's just Earth, one small solar system, a portion of just one galaxy, and one galaxy is just one of infinitely others in the grand scale of the universe. So yeah, there's some big differences between humans. It's all pretty small, so let's just respect the differences and be human together.